All right, and I believe we are live now. So, Assalamu alaikum, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our CICW Book Talk Online. And today we have with us Dr. Tazeen Ali. Tazeen, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, as many of you probably know, we have our book talk series online that we had started at the onset of COVID. So far, we have done more than 20 these book talks, and you can find them on our YouTube channel. If you are watching us now, you're watching on YouTube, so it would be very easy to click to our channel, subscribe, but also watch the previous book talks. We have a variety of speakers and topics. Today, we are extremely lucky and grateful to have with us Dr. Tazeen Ali, who is assistant professor on religion and politics in Washington University at St. Louis. She's the author of this book that we're going to talk about today, The Women's Mosque of America, Authority and Community in U.S. Islam. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we all know that we are in a very difficult period in history. Many of us are going through a very difficult time. And so I just hope that everybody is taking good care of themselves and that are seeking help of whatever sort is needed to make sure that we all process everything that's going on at this time. And we are really grateful to you, Dr. Tazeen, for doing this with us because we have to go on and we have to do what we do. So I'm going to start this book talk with a question that I always ask first of every single guest, and that is, why did you write this book and what is its main argument?
Thank you. So to zoom out a little bit, when I was in graduate school, I was always interested in studying Islam and gender, and thinking about scriptural and legal texts and how they were used in contemporary communities and how they applied specifically to the lives of Muslim women. And so then I remember back in 2015, seeing in the media that this women's mosque had emerged in Los Angeles, and they were posting their khutbahs, their sermons online. And I was really struck by how they were deploying the Quran. And really, I became drawn to the discursive project that I saw unfolding in that space in terms of women's sermons, women's khutbahs, and the dissemination of women's knowledge and thinking about how they were reading scripture. And so, thinking about for why I wrote the book, I really wanted to draw attention to that space and write it into the history of Islam in America and include these women's contributions into the academic study of Islam to really take them seriously as religious actors who were legitimate contributors and mediators of the Islamic tradition. I think that they're often overlooked or sidelined when we think about these big picture questions in Islamic studies, as far as questions about religious authority and so on. So that's why I wrote it and how I got into it. The main argument of the book is really that the Women's Mosque of America is a site where lay Muslim women are able to cultivate religious authority based on their gendered experiences, where they're reading the Quran through a social justice lens and offering a model of authority that's challenging marginalizing and patriarchal trends in Muslim communities. And it's based on a selection, on an analysis of a selection of women's khutbahs, as well as some ethnographic interviews in the community.
Thank you so much. That's a very direct answer, and I think it sets the stage very well for our discussion. Let's go immediately into the beef of the book and tell us about the main protagonist, so to say, which is an institution here, the
Yeah.
Women's Mosque of America. So tell us a little bit about this institution, about its formation, the founding principles, people behind it, anything you can tell us to sort of introduce our viewers to this institution.
Sure. So the Women's Mosque of America, as you say, the protagonist of the book is this institution. And so I would describe it as a multiracial congregation that's exclusively for Muslim women and their interfaith female allies in Los Angeles. And this is a place where women are calling the adhan, the call to prayer. They're the ones delivering the khutbahs, the sermons. They're the ones leading ritual prayer at monthly Jummah services, so monthly Friday prayer services. And these are services that, again, are exclusively for women. Boys under age 12 are also allowed. And it was founded in 2015, so that situates us temporally. It's a relatively new space. It was founded by Hassan Masnavi, who's an American Muslim comedy writer of South Asian heritage. And so in terms of thinking about what is the community, they're not a purpose-built mosque, so they're renting out space once a month, and it's moved locations a few times. Right now, it's at the First Unitarian Church in Koreatown in Los Angeles. But they've also always had an online presence. So similar to how we're having this conversation online, they have been live streaming their sermons. Since before the pandemic, I think since the middle of 2018, and they've been posting their sermons to YouTube, live streaming them on Facebook. And so even when we think about the community in Southern California, really they're signaling and meant to be really focusing on an audience much broader than the women who are physically congregating in Southern California. Let's see some other demographic information. So in terms of congregant numbers, as you know, there's always a flux of how many people will be there. I think in the early years, especially in 2015, there was anywhere between 75 and 100 congregants at each Jummah every month. That has since dwindled, especially during the pandemic. But in terms of demographics, there is a core constituency of African American Muslim women over the age of 60, who other congregants would often describe as being like the heart of the community. There are also some elderly white Christian and Jewish women in that same age range who would come consistently as interfaith allies. And there's also an ethnically, I describe it as a multiracial community. So there's also an ethnically diverse group of younger women in their 20s and 30s who are Black, South Asian, white, Arab, East Asian, Latina, who are also coming regularly. And this is really a space to kind of, even though this is the main focus of the book and the main character, it's not an isolated space in the sense that spaces like the Women's Mosque have since emerged, begin to crop up all over the US and Europe over the last 7 years. And they are a response to a broader mosque culture in the US that's really speaking to and this gets us to those underlying principles. Their emergence speaks to a history of exclusion of women in mosques throughout the country. And by exclusion, I mean through things like inadequate physical prayer spaces, scarcity in leadership roles, limited access to religious education. And so the idea that's underpinning the Women's Mosque of America is that women deserve access to these things. They deserve access to a prayer space, to religious knowledge, to leadership. And so it's responding to a lack of women in leadership roles in mosques across the country, and not just prayer leadership, but being on an executive board or something, other kinds of roles. And so they're responding to the lack of women even on executive boards across the country, even in mosques where women are allowed to serve on boards. And so one of those founding principles was that the Women's Mosque could serve as this kind of complementary space, almost a remedial space, where women could then gain confidence and feel empowered to go back to their regular mosque communities and decide to take on more leadership roles or run for the board. And so that's really how it branded itself, as a space that was not competing with conventional mosques, but really something that could be complementary and cohesive and productive to Muslim communities as a whole and other mosque communities.
Yeah, that's great. I think your answer sets up kind of good segue for the next question that I have. I think you have partly already answered it, but I think I want you to elaborate on it. And the question is, why are women-only spaces so important? In other words, what can they achieve that can be achieved in, so to say, mainstream traditional mosques and religious institutions?
Yeah, that's a tricky question in some ways. It's an interesting one because a lot of the folks I interviewed had actually changed their views on how they felt about women-only spaces after having been part of this women-only space at the Women's Mosque. But I think initially, for some folks, when the mosque was first coming to fruition, when the talks were being made public, the plans for it, um, the critique from them was that women-only spaces felt like a step backwards and, support of gender segregation. And there was also some of the commentary from non-Muslim spectators, because obviously this is all happening very publicly under the non-Muslim gaze, under the mainstream Muslim community gaze. And so the critique from non-Muslim spaces was that this was a step backwards. They saw women-only spaces as somehow anti-modern, inherently sort of oppressive to women, hiding them away. And then on the part of some of the folks in the community, especially some of the African American women, the elder African American women who I mentioned or described as really being this heart of the community, some of them were initially very reticent or maybe even skeptical, I might say, of how productive a women-only space could be. And that was rooted in the fact that when they were excited by the idea of, serving as a katiba, being able to give a khutbah, but they wanted their men to be a part of that experience in terms of, them saying, I want my son to hear this. I want my husband to hear this. Men in our community should hear women's voices. So that was kind of the hesitation to kind of fully throw their support behind this space. But then after experiencing the Women's Mosque of America, which was very sort of steadfast in its aim to always be only a women's space, a lot of them just did a complete 180, remarking that it was this very restorative, rejuvenating, nourishing experience that they didn't know that they needed. And so I want to just quickly flag that this is actually coming from women who didn't feel marginalized in their own mosque communities. And I think that's important to note because I think coming into it, I didn't realize the extent to which there was so much variation for why folks participated in this space. So in the women's mosque community, people are all coming for different reasons, and a large percentage of them were actually very active members in their own community mosques. Some of them even had leadership roles. So I remember another congregant mentioning, and she was of Arab heritage. And so she actually described the women only aspect as a kind of comfortable return to social spaces of her childhood where women would have women only gatherings. And she described it as a respite from the rest of her life, which she said happened to be very male dominated in terms of her workspace, her social life. And so there were some women who I think were already familiar with the context of women only spaces and they found it very comforting. And then I had another congregant whose experience sticks out. She was actually not a part of another mosque community. She had had negative experiences in mosques growing up, where she felt like she always had to kind of hide or be treated as a second-class citizen. And then she explained that she loved the women-only aspect of the mosque because she was like, oh, well, there's no one to hide from. Women weren't hiding. They didn't have to be second-class citizens because they were the dominant group. And so she kind of compared it to the importance of having living in a white supremacist state, like the importance of having Black only spaces, of these kinds of safe, intimate spaces where you can kind of be more free and feel that kind of nurturing quality of being in a safe space. And I think that was because of the level of intimacy of having a women only congregation, that they would describe it as, a very moving experience to be a part of a communal prayer of just women. And then after each prayer, there's actually a discussion circle, which is kind of like a Q&A between congregants and the katiba. And a lot of times this turned into very intimate conversations where people would share very sensitive or emotional experiences. And that was, I think, facilitated by the fact that it was a women only space. So going back to the part of your question of, what would be difficult to replicate elsewhere in a traditional configuration of a co-ed mosque. And so I think that kind of intimate experience would be difficult, if not impossible to replicate in a conventional mosque setting where women don't really have that kind of direct access to the imam or the khatib in the first place. But then secondarily being able to kind of share a lot of times more intimate knowledge about their lives, relating them to the khutbah that they've just heard. And I think that was really facilitated by it being sort of a that gender, well, not gender segregated, but a women only space.
Yeah, and that's great. I think before we continue with the next question that I had, something came to my mind, and I think you briefly mentioned it in your book as well. This is not unprecedented in a sense, there are quite a bit had been written now about women's mosque in China, for instance, or about female preachers in different contexts, whether it be murshidat in Morocco, qubaysiyat in Syria,
Mm-hmm.
or state-sponsored preachers in Turkey or Malaysia or Indonesia, many places.
Yeah.
So maybe if you maybe just take a moment to reflect on the place of these women's mosques in kind of on a global scale, how is it related to these other spaces that exist, and what's new about WMA, if anything?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of how are they themselves invoking these comparisons, and also what can we as scholars and as an audience or as readers, how can we situate that into a larger global Islamic trend? And I think that the way that you started this question is key in terms of they are very in their own branding. So in the narrative of the institution, there's a strong emphasis on the fact that this is not an unprecedented occurrence, and there are kind of in a lot of the early sort of media interviews, they would very readily refer to how these kinds of mosques existed in other parts of the world. But I think that in some ways, the way that and that's a way to that becomes a tool to claim legitimacy, and not to mark it as disingenuous or to say that that's not true, because as you just listed, there are all of these examples of women taking up religious authority roles in China and Syria and India and Turkey, whatever that might be, whether they're the head of a Sufi order or giving khutbahs in spaces, or just teachers, traditional teachers. But I think that is a very important part of the narrative, to kind of show that this is something that's authentically Islamic, that's coming out of the tradition, out of the historical Islamic tradition, and also that's something that's very much rooted in scripture. The extent to which they directly engage these other models, I think if we're to step out of their institutional narrative, is a little bit more thin, I would say, and possibly because it's not necessarily relevant. But for example, we can think about the mosques, the women-only mosques in China. But then if we kind of look in some more detail, the women-only mosques in China very strictly follow the Hanafi school of law, and so women actually aren't leading prayer there. They're not engaged in congregational prayer because that's not considered sort of legally acceptable. But there's other kinds of functions, and so I think they're not. I don't think that this necessarily that kind of nuance or detail is entering into the institutional narrative. But it's still important to kind of think about that these mosques exist, even if the details are kind of different. So what I would say is new at the Women's Mosque of America is the insistence on, first of all, calling it a mosque. And so I think that there was some initial community pushback to say, why don't you call it a women's center where women are giving lectures? And they were very sort of adamant in saying, no, we're going to call it a mosque. And these are women giving khutbahs. These are religious sermons before a Friday prayer, before Jummah. This is not just a women's center where people are giving lectures, even if the form, as we can talk about later in terms of the form of the khutbahs and how they're different. But it was very important to kind of establish that this is not a third space. This is not an alternative space, because we've seen the emergence of a lot of these alternative kind of communities throughout the world, but especially in the US, in terms of thinking about people who are unmosqued or don't feel at home in the primary space. And they're very deliberate in saying, well, this is not a third space. This is actually, a primary space of a mosque. I think that's something that's different, even as they're situating themselves within a history. They're actually citing, so for the mosque leaders, and I think some of the early khatibas also mentioned this, they really reference the idea that the Prophet Muhammad would set aside a day for to teach women after some like Sahaba women, female companions of the Prophet had complained that, hey, we can't really hear the khutbah, we can't really, we're not able to kind of have direct access to these lessons of teaching the Quran. And so they cite that example of the Prophet Muhammad saying, okay, we're going to have one day a week that's allotted to teaching his female companions. And so they're very much situating themselves in that Islamic historical tradition, which is, I think, important to the overall narrative.
Thank you, and thank you for taking time to reflect on this, on relevance of this on global scale. Now, before we continue, I just want to, for the sake of our audience, mention, because I didn't mention it at the beginning, that we're going to go for about another maybe 10 to 15 minutes with these questions and answers, and then we're going to turn to our audience. So in the meantime, if anybody in the audience has a question or a comment, you can write it on our YouTube chat. Where you're watching, you can just write a question or a comment, and please make sure that you identify yourself and your institution or country, whatever you can include that can help us understand, because we also want to get understanding how global our audience is, you know. So to move on, so interpretive authority is at the core of your book. Why is it so important? And how do Muslim women gain authority at the WMA? And finally, please explain the place of English language in all of this.
Yeah, thank you. So I do agree that this is at the core of the book in terms of thinking about women's interpretive authority, which I'm defining just as authority to read and interpret the Quran. And this is important in the broader context of the book, because when we think about the Women's Mosque of America, ritual authority is likely the first thing that comes to mind for many folks in terms of conversations really being dominated by the question of women-led prayer. Is it legitimate? Is it valid? Is it even appropriate? And so on and so forth. But I argue in the book that members of the actual community are not that invested in getting involved in those kinds of debates, which could become kind of heated over ritual authority in a way that's almost that can be distracting, I think. And so it seems to me that, so my argument in the book is that they don't seem that publicly invested in getting involved in debates over the technicalities of the legality of ritual prayer in a way that can be read as almost subversive. And so what I'm arguing in the book is that interpretive authority is actually the interesting thing that's going on in this space, because these women are making this strong case for being able to exercise the right to interpret the Quran as a lay Muslim, so someone who does not have scholarly credentials. And they're emphasizing this by extending that platform of khatiba to lay Muslim women who are not scholars to give khutbahs. And English is the English language piece of it is very central to this cultivation of lay interpretive authority, because it's not predicated on Arabic expertise. And so for a lot of these khatibas, the value of English, of reading the Quran in English, is the sense of accessibility and an unmediated connection to God that it can facilitate, which means it really thinks about how to apply particular Quranic verses into the daily lives of believers. So that is something that I argue in the book is serving as a kind of challenge to the Arab centricity and patriarchal dominance that's typically characterizing Islamic authority and knowledge. And there is this inherent critique of American Muslim tendencies to really venerate Arab male scholars and their patriarchal interpretations that often marginalize women. And so for example, in the first sort of inaugural khutbah at the Women's Mosque, Adina Likovic is making this argument that that adhering to sort of traditional male interpretive authority can interfere with an individual's personal relationship with God. And she's sort of sharing with the congregation how English translations of the Quran have been central for her being able to remain Muslim and have that unmediated connection with God. And so and then there's also the fact, like thinking about continuity, that that non-scholars are serving as male preachers, as khatibs in US mosques all the time. So there's again this claim of continuity, emphasizing that the women's mosque isn't doing anything new here. It's just expanding the practices to include women. But overall, there's this definitive stance on the Quran here, and that where it's intellectualized and its meaning is privileged over its liturgical use in a way. And so it's kind of this process of transforming English into a sacred Islamic language by a kind of rationalization, intellectualization of the Quran, where the meaning of the text is privileged over, or even just seen as equally important to its recitation in Arabic during ritual. And there have been a number of sermons at the Women's Mosque that emphasize how important it is to really understand the meaning of the Quran in English. And so that's something that there's almost a looking down on the sort of mere act of Quran recitation. And I say that with air quotes because obviously, as we know, like Muslim cultures and communities across history and region have placed an enormous emphasis on the sonic value of the Quran as something that's meant to be heard and recited in Arabic, as having like a lot of spiritual currency. But there is this sort of intellectual stance on why it's important to engage the meaning of the Quran, and that's sort of seen as the thing that imbues your meaning, that imbues your prayer with the actual sort of as a meaningful practice. So that's sort of where we get at the centrality of what English language translations are doing in this space.
Yeah, so I'm also reminded of, a few decades ago, the late Ismail al-Farouqi, he wrote this short book called Toward Islamic English. I don't know if you're familiar with it,
Mm.
in which he tried to sort of domesticate Islam within English language. And I think WMA is in a way doing this through its experiment, through its emphasis on the use of English. One part of your book that I particularly loved was when you write about embodied authority. That is to say, not only text-derived authority, but authority to practice and embodiment. So can you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, so the Women's Mosque leans into um, the idea that women giving khutbahs is a unique chance, that the Women's Mosque of America provides this unique opportunity to be able to hear from everyday lay Muslim women talk about their everyday experiences. So the expectation is whoever is serving as khatiba is going to draw on some kind of personal experience to weave into their khutbah and to weave into their reading of the Quran. And so the way that they're selecting verses from the Quran to talk about in their khutbahs. And so the idea there is that the khutbahs aren't just unique from the ones that are being delivered at other mosques, but they're actually adding something new. They're adding an in-depth perspective on the Quran by tying women's experiences to particular verses where it makes them more personal to congregants, and that makes that in turn more powerful, more engaging. And so this is something that, rather than attempt to emulate a kind of male style of preaching at mainstream mosques, the leadership here at the WMA is cultivating a form of authority that, so mosque leaders are actually instructing khatibas to share their vulnerability, to weave in a personal narrative. And this is rooted in the assumption that women have something distinct to offer when they read scripture, that they can read the Quran in a way that men cannot by virtue of them not being women. So of reading the text through the embodied experience of being a woman. So an example of this, of what it means to cultivate authority based on your embodied experiences. An example that I discuss in the book is a khutbah that's based on that discusses sexual violence, and it's delivered by a survivor of sexual assault, who's someone who also does nonprofit work in providing support to victims of gender violence. So it's a way where experiences are actually standing in for scholarly expertise and being able to interpret the Quran in an authoritative way. So it's these women approaching the text not as scholars, but as people who have lived through particular experiences and then reading verses through that lens. And this is something that my interviewees often would say, that hearing from these kind of everyday women really allowed them to connect to scripture on a deeper level, because they felt like It was coming from these women's personal stories, and they felt like if they were talking about experiences like motherhood or grief or sexual violence or divorce, and it just had a different level of credibility to them from women talking about experience that they themselves have lived through, and they weren't ever really used to seeing that in other mosques.
Yeah, thank you. So to elaborate on this or to expand, you also are in your book discuss authority through activism, place of social justice, community building, interfaith inclusivity, interfaith solidarity. There are a lot of different aspects. So can
Yeah.
you maybe, in a way, I know this is a big chunk of your book, but if you could maybe summarize for us and our viewers some of the main issues here related to activism and social justice, intrafaith, interfaith relations, and so on.
Yeah, there so in terms of thinking about the mosque as an activist space, the idea of authority being acquired through activism again goes back to the idea of what resonated with the community is what gives the mosque credibility. And so this had to do with how khatibas were using scripture, how they're using the Quran to engage social justice issues. So that's central in the conceptual universe of the WMA. Again, that's not unique, as we know many communities, especially like Black communities, have often approached the Quran as, a text of racial uplift, of one that advocates for social justice issues. Um, and so, but because, and when we're thinking specifically about the American context, the Women's Mosque is thoroughly situated in the context of rampant Islamophobia in the second half of the 2010s. More generally, um, the white supremacist American socio-political landscape. And so the book is centering how these women are constructing authority and trying to create more gender egalitarian norms and practices against trends in their own community, against patriarchal trends, but also against the backdrop of rampant anti-Muslim racism, which is itself rooted in anti-Blackness, in terms of Muslims being racialized as others, in terms of how they're conceived of as in relation to the state. And so if we think about how American Muslim history is rooted in Black history and Black communities, it's much easier to think about particular social justice issues, when we think about anti-Black racism as particularly Muslim issues, right? There's Black women in this community, so Black issues and Muslim issues are one and the same. And so when we think about movements like Black Lives Matter or issues of police brutality, these are the kinds of issues that matter to Muslim women in America, including those in this community. And so when folks at the Women's Mosque on a leadership level are talking about these issues, they're cultivating a kind of authority based on those activist commitments, because it's resonating with people. It's making them legible as credible religious authority figures because they're putting religious teachings in conversation with contemporary social justice concerns, which a number of them are just very concerned with. These are issues close to their heart. And then for those who might not be as aware, the mosque is a space where they're becoming more aware of those sorts of issues. And so that's what I mean by authority through activism, right? So that's attracting a lot of folks in terms of thinking about what makes them credible. When we think about the intra and interfaith Muslim inclusivity, again, I talked about how it's a diverse community in terms of ethnic diversity, racial diversity, and as far as the interfaith inclusivity space, it's really the Women's Mosque is branding itself as a middle ground, non-denominational space where all self-identifying Muslim women are welcome to come and pray. So they're accommodating for Shia women in their prayer. Shia khatibas have given khutbahs. There have also been some Sufi women who've given khutbahs. One of the interviewees in the book that I interview is an Ahmadi woman. So there's something that's, I would say, very distinct about the space. I don't mean in the sense that, of course, there's non-Sunni women praying in Sunni mosques all the time in America, but maybe they're not calling attention to their minority status. Especially, I know, like for Ahmadis, there's a lot of sort of fear in maybe identifying themselves that way because of particular politics of their countries of origin. But so what's different here is that not only are these different sectarian Muslim ones who have different sectarian identities coming to pray, but the messaging is very explicit that they're welcome. As far as interfaith inclusivity, there's a few levels of that. So on one level, On the intimate level of that, that sort of includes interfaith extended families. So in the book, I talk about one of the katibas who's Latina, Mexican American. She actually uses her khutbah to kind of admonish Arab and South Asian Muslims and telling them they should be more mindful and welcoming of new Latina converts and help them maintain ties with their Catholic family members in terms of, don't make it harder for them if they want to celebrate holidays with their family, and kind of making them more aware of the profound feelings of alienation that new converts can sometimes experience by breaking from an older tradition. But in the broader sense of interfaith inclusivity, I mentioned earlier that the Women's Mosque is open to women of all faiths. There's a consistent presence, at least when I was doing field work in 2017, of Jewish and Christian allies who would come to show their support. They wouldn't participate in the prayer, but they were there and they were also part of the discussion circles. And so that interfaith engagement in some ways is a hallmark of American religious communities, especially in minoritized ones like Muslims. And so that's been an important aspect of like post 9/11 outreach to kind of deconstruct stereotypes and all of that. And so in that regard, it's the Women's Mosque interfaith work is pretty continuous with other communities, but it's also very new in the sense of it's making it central to the mosque community. And yeah, there's also, not to discredit that, but it's also, I think I see it as also very reflective of how American Muslims are, always making decisions against the backdrop of Islamophobia. There's a need to always be open, to always be welcoming to outsiders, which is really interesting to kind of juxtapose that with the idea of thinking about this as an exclusively women's space that's just for women, a safe sanctuary away from men who have dominated other kinds of spaces. And then what does it mean to then not have a space that's really just exclusively Muslim? And that's not to undermine, what folks find generative about that built-in interfaith element, but it's also from that outsider perspective, it helps us kind of think about how Muslim communities always have something to prove. They're always vying for kind of acceptance, and there is an expectation that they have to gain the approval of religious outsiders, or at least kind of prove they're willing to have those conversations as being welcoming. So that's sort of what I mean by the politics of that. There's definitely an uneven power dynamic there.
Yeah, that's great. So many layers there and so much to think about. I have one more question, one final question before we turn to our audience. And I can see we already have some questions from our audience. So just to kind of wrap up our conversation, I want to ask you, how can your work help us in recentering Muslim women's experience in contemporary Islam?
Yeah, so I think I may mention this to one of the earlier questions, but this book is really my effort to write American Muslim women into the history of Islam in America, and write them into broader scholarly conversations about authority, about Islamic authority. And so the book draws our attention to these alternative models of Islamic authority that are very much rooted in Muslim women's experiences, and how these experiences can be used to interpret the Quran and apply them to contemporary Muslim life. So the book is showing how American Muslim women are contributing to the Islamic tradition in real time within lived communities. And it hopefully makes the case that studying these kinds of communities can help us think about larger developments in broader global Islamic debates.
That's great. Thank you. And of course, I wish to continue this conversation, but I don't want to monopolize it. So I want to turn over to our audience. So we have first question from Nicole. She says, Salam Tazeen, congratulations on your book. In what ways is the Women's Mosque Sunni-centric? Or are there other branches of Islam represented there? I think you talked a little bit about this, but obviously you can elaborate. And then she's also asking, do you see the same type of tensions related to authority based on with which branch the members identify? So so I hope this is clear. So go ahead and answer these two questions, then we can move to the next one.
Sure. So I think it definitely is a Sunni-centric space. I mean, it brands itself as non-denominational, so all are welcome. But the ritual prayer that's followed, when a Khatiba leads prayer, is done in the Sunni conventions. They do accommodate for some Shia differences. And as I mentioned, I can just reiterate, they've had women from other denominations give khutbahs. So there have been some Shia scholars who have come to give a khutbah. There was somebody who was part of the Chisti Sufi order. So they do represent other kinds of denominations or other kinds of branches of Islam. As far as if I understood the second part of the question, if you see these tensions in authority playing out among congregants, was that the question? Um,
I think it's about, do you see the same types of tensions related to authority based on with which branch the members identify? So kind of maybe similar tensions that exists in other mosques that,
oh, yeah. So I think,
do they translate to this space as well? That I think that's probably, I don't know.
yeah, I think that that might be harder to measure without
Yeah.
having been immersed in these other kinds of communities. But one thing I will say is that there's a certain kind of person who's drawn to pray at the Women's Mosque of America, and and that's not to undermine the mosque's commitment to being continuous with the Islamic tradition. But for example, I can think back to one of my interviewees who's an Ahmadi Muslim, and she talks about how others in her community might not feel comfortable praying in a non-Ahmadi mosque, but because she was so accustomed to being a minority within a minority and being in college, that she was kind of more willing to be okay with particular areas of tension that might not align with the jurisprudential preferences or norms of her own community. So I think that there are these same tensions that are in other communities as far as what's considered legitimate of who to pray behind. Can you pray behind a Sunni imam? But they didn't really, that wasn't a topic of public conversation at the women's mosque, because I think there was kind of a tacit understanding that folks were kind of willing to be flexible around legal norms in this particular space.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is from Professor Patrick De Silva from University of Denver, and thanks for, I assume you signed up quite a few of your students for this talk, and I really am grateful for that. He says, thanks for your talk. Given the emphasis on English language translation of the Quran, do members of the WMA have a favorite or preferred translation?
That's a good question. I think as far as the founder of the mosque, I think in because she has this guidebook, I think she prefers the Muhammad Assad translation, but I don't think that necessarily translates as a uniform preference among the community. I think they're kind of free to refer to whatever translation they want to work with it. And I think that applies to a lot of other kinds of questions that you might think about in terms of the women's mosque, that there's just not a whole lot of uniformity in position, because people are coming in with all kinds of different perspectives, and that's kind of where the majority of the congregants see the richness coming from. So there isn't sort of this streamlined universal or uniform stance on any particular issue. And that's very much also a part of their branding, to say that, we're open to all views and we're a middle ground space and we're not imposing any particular views. But that's a great question.
Yeah, so Professor De Silva just confirmed he made it required for his Islam in America class today. So welcome to University of Denver students, and thank you for being
Yeah, thank
with us
you.
today. And we have, I think, one of the students actually with a question, Jewel Nichols. She's asking, are there efforts within the WMA to include other members of minoritized groups like those of the LGBTQ plus community?
That's a really great question that I um, tried to think carefully about how to address that in the book without um, trying to undermine the mosque leader's own sort of testimony or own narrative about themselves. But I will say that it is a mosque insofar it's an inclusive space insofar as that any self-identifying woman is invited. So that includes trans women who identify women. That's the only requirement to kind of come into the space, is that you self-identify as a woman. I do think that it is a space that's very much concerned with legitimacy in mainstream Muslim communities. So, as far as I'm aware of, as of now, there has never been an openly trans woman katiba yet, an openly queer Muslim woman katiba yet. And so, and I don't mean that to say that it's not inclusive of LGBTQ identities, but it's not a part of their branding and narrative. And similar to how you won't find the word feminist anywhere on their website or in their branding. And so I think because they're very much vying for mainstream legitimacy from other Muslim communities, they are not as they're not very explicit or overt in making active efforts to be inclusive of these other kinds of marginalized communities in the way that we see in other spaces that we see in Masjid Rabia in Chicago, which is a queer-led, woman-led initiative, the Inclusive Mosque Initiative in London, which is much more explicit about inclusivity in terms of LGBTQ Muslims, or the Al Tawhid Jummah circles in Toronto. But I do think that some of these other spaces are maybe not as, especially the Al Tawhid Jummah circles, which long predate like 2012, like earlier than the Women's Mosque, as well as the Inclusive Mosque Initiative in London. They sometimes don't have as much of a public presence as the Women's Mosque of America. They don't court the same kind of media relationship, precisely because they're more protective of members of their congregation who, for example, might not be out to their families. So it's a different kind of space. And so not to say that it's not inclusive of those identities, but it's definitely not a part of their branding or in how they sort of narrate themselves.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question. We have one more question from Abby Frankel. The question is, do you think the success of WMA will inspire a trend of women-only mosques in the US?
That's a great question. I think in some ways it has already, right? There's other spaces. So in 2017, a woman-led space cropped up in Berkeley. That I just mentioned, the one in Chicago. And then there's women-led mosques in Copenhagen and Berlin, in London. So it has sort of started this wave of other kinds of alternative spaces, whether they're mixed gender spaces or women only spaces or queer inclusive spaces. So I think that to answer the question, yes, I think that it has inspired that kind of change. I think it's a little more unclear of whether it will actualize its goal of trying to encourage women to then go back to their conventional mosque communities and encourage them to run for leadership roles. I think that's a bit early to know whether they're going to realize that goal in terms of thinking about if they're enacting change in the long term yet.
Thank you. So let me see. We don't have a question. So I have one more question if there are no more questions from the audience, and maybe that could be the one that we conclude on unless we receive one more from the audience. I think we do have time for one more question. So if you feel like asking, now is the time. But I want to ask you this, Dr. Ali, in terms of the basic takeaway. So maybe two takeaways. One, for the study of religion, methodologically speaking, what would you like people to take away from your book in terms of relevance for the study of religion, methodology, and so on? And then the other aspect of this is, in terms of the Muslim community in America, what would you like to be the main takeaway from your book?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of thinking about big picture takeaways. So I think on the one hand, I feel like maybe something that I mentioned in the first part of our conversation, but in terms of thinking about um, global developments in Islamic authority and how Islamic authority is constructed, I think one of my big picture takeaways I would like for people to kind of come away from the book thinking that we should take seriously the United States as a part of the so-called Muslim world, rather than only thinking about the US as only kind of a minority context or something that's on the margins, or something as that's particular to a minority context or to the margins, because we can see how American Muslim women are contributing as meaningful actors. They're contributing to the Islamic tradition as it's unfolding, as it's being negotiated in real time, as it's being lived out in communities. And so this is a way to understand that developments in American Islam have implications for communities and societies beyond their own. So what happens in terms of developments in American Islam have global implications. And so it's this effort to really think about the United States as like a central part of the Muslim world. And then in thinking about sort of just the study of Islam as well, and thinking about that more specifically of how to think about studying religion in America or American religious history, this is something that I hope shows that small communities like the Women's Mosque help us understand how this fits into broader sort of American trends of how religious communities play out, to cement the idea that Islam is an American religion.
Thank you so much. Let me see. We have another question. It says, Ibrahim from University of Denver. I think you talked about this with the interviewees, but how does the need for women, especially of those that grew up abroad, to feel like they're at home shape the experience at these mosques? How does the need for women to feel like they're at home shape the experience at these mosques? I think you talked a little bit about it earlier, but obviously, if you could elaborate on it, that'd be great.
Yeah, so sorry if I'm understanding the question correctly. It's for women who grew up abroad, how does the Women's Mosque sort of accommodate for them feeling at home? That's a really interesting question. Because the form and function of mosques is not really consistent globally in terms of what the life of a mosque is, what it could be used for. So in some ways, the idea of public inclusion in a mosque is in some ways informed by the American context of where houses of worship take on like a civic life where people are present. There's men and women present in worship. They're both public. It's also the site for other kinds of community outreach. So that's very much informed by the American context where mosques take on a role that's beyond just a place for prayer. And so I think that for a lot of American Muslims, because the context of America is such that houses of worship are these centers for community, for communal life, or communal family life, the marginalization in some spaces is felt more dramatically, and there is more of an effort to make changes or to say that we're not okay with the status quo and we want there to be we want women to have more physical space, we want women to have more access, we want more women to have more respect, have a more visible role in public religious life, which is not something that would necessarily translate. So even for my own example, so I'm Bangladeshi American, and my mother and other like female relatives didn't grow up going to the mosque. And so therefore they don't regularly go to the mosque here in the US, and they don't feel marginalized from it because it's just not something that they do. And so it's not something that they necessarily feel excluded from. So I think cultural norms also inform what you kind of identify as the problem, and what you would like to kind of see moving forward. So I think there might be different ideas about that. And then there's also a huge like racial discrepancy within the mosque itself of what what kind of relationships women had to their community mosques. So a lot of African American women felt really at home in their community mosque. They're more likely to have leadership positions there. And so they weren't coming from this place of marginalization, whereas a lot of South Asian and Arab congregants tended to have that experience of marginalization in their mainstream mosques. So I think wherever you were coming from, as I mentioned, people were participating in the Women's Mosque for a number of different reasons and looking to it to fulfill a number of different goals depending on where they were coming from and what they are looking for.
Yeah, it seems to me one thing that came very clearly through our conversation is the idea of tremendous diversity of experiences that people have when it comes to Islam, both men and women, but in this case, especially women, immigrant women, American-born women, depending on their cultural experience and historical experience. It seems to me that the Women's Mosque of America is trying its best to capture that diversity and to translate it into kind of lived experience. That to me is kind of the biggest, personally, as a reader of the book and as discussing with you, is the biggest thing that I've learned from this is just that diversity of experiences and how important but also challenging it could be to accommodate all of those different experiences at the same time. With that being said, I don't think we have any more questions. I think this would be a good time to bring our conversation to a conclusion. So if there's anything else, Dr. Tazeen, that you would like maybe to share with us before we conclude, any parting thoughts?
Thank you so much. This has been a very enriching conversation. It's always a privilege to be able to be in conversation with folks who have generously read and engaged the text. So I appreciate it. And thank you all for your questions in the audience.
You're most welcome. And thank you so much for joining us today. Both our guest and speaker, Dr. Tazeen Ali. Once again, congratulations on this phenomenal book. And I hope more people read it and acquire it and assign it in their classes. Thank you all who have joined us today. And thank you for your questions. Please sign up for our newsletter. You can do that by going to our website, contemporaryislam.org, so that you can stay abreast of everything that we do and all the upcoming book talks. I think we are done for the book talks for this semester. For our book talk series, we do have one book talk that we had canceled earlier and that we may need to reschedule it. And so you'll be duly informed about that. But please be on the lookout for our spring semester book talk series as well. Once again, thank you all. Wish you all the best. Stay safe, stay well, stay healthy, and assalamu alaikum, and have a great day.